Hello, everyone. Welcome to Panel 2 on Response and Resilience. I am Chloe Demrovsky, President and CEO of Disaster Recovery Institute International. Today, we will look at providing flexibility and the need to invest in and empower communities, plus the importance of giving an inclusive response, considering the rights of people and their culture. Panelists will also assess the need for clear requirements of what is needed, emphasizing the need for renewable, sustainable solutions while supporting existing capabilities to build capacity for better resilience. What factors has the COVID-19 pandemic highlighted that may not have been previously considered? We'll get into all of these topics and more, but I want to start off with some key points. So each panelist will have about 5 minutes to introduce some of the key takeaways from their experience and organizations, and then we'll follow that with a more conversational discussion on some of the broader themes. So we'll launch right into it. I will first introduce Sam Tidwell. He is the volunteer partner to the director for the Americas region at the American Red Cross. Sam, take it away.
It's a pleasure to be with you, even from afar. Dr. Roberto Brito, our director of the Americas region of American Red Cross International Services, sends his regrets. He had a critical issue that came up he must handle and asked me to represent him. And as a volunteer partner to him, I'm glad to do that. I've retired from the Red Cross after 37 years of service, and I came back to volunteer with this great network of international partners and our international team. I want to cover 3 main points. First, to emphasize how critical we take local empowerment and inclusion in our international Red Cross movement, as we use networks to build community capacity all over the world. Then I'll touch briefly on the need to be flexible and finally talk about listening to our customers, clients, disaster survivors, however one wants to refer to them. The Red Cross movement includes national societies in 192 countries that come together to work in the International Federation of Red Cross Red Crescent, Ifrc for short. Our national societies have deep networks in local communities, relying on individuals in those communities to not only be involved in preparedness and response, but to drive implementation of Red Cross programs in each community, to adapt that framework of our practices so that they can be effective wherever crises occur. The success of Red Cross work lies in the empowerment of people at the local level to adapt programs and practices in a manner that reaches everyone. And we do the work of preparedness and response mostly through a core of about 12 million volunteers who are supported by a much smaller contingent of employees. The preamble of the Ifrc strategy for this decade is titled Local Action, Global Reach. And I want to read you part of the preamble. Quote, through the wide and deep reach of our national societies, we are uniquely placed to support people and communities before, during, and after shocks and hazards through national societies' permanent presence in communities. Their role is auxiliaries to public authorities in the humanitarian field, and their extensive network of local branches and volunteers in almost every country in the world engaging in local action. Strategy 2030 embodies this long-standing vision and further enhances it to ensure that Red Crescent remains a dynamic global network of organizations that are fit for purpose and always there to accompany people and communities. Unquote. An organization cannot accomplish this without a deep, inclusive network of local volunteers who interact all the time with local governments and organizations, with diverse neighborhoods, who understand local customs, risks, assets, etc., and are willing to roll up their sleeves and be part of the action. Now, the most critical, most important word we have in our vernacular is flexibility. No actual disaster or crises, as we all know, happens as planned. The goal is to be well enough prepared to quickly adjust to what real circumstances are, and no two people or two families are faced with exactly the same issues. 2 programs that address flexibility that I want to hit on are cash or voucher assistance and forecast-based financing, both of which are big efforts in the Red Cross movement. Let me tell you about the extent of our cash and voucher assistance. The movement in the years 2017 and 2018 reached 9.22 million people with direct in-hand cash, providing them over 1.5 billion Swiss francs. This is money they can use as they need to. No one is telling them what they need to do or what to buy. They can use it for food or non-food items. So this allows them to maintain dignity and is the most flexible and efficient way of addressing the specific needs of their individual families. Now, this does not replace other traditional response programs, but enhances them. And forecast-based financing is quickly growing. The aim is to forecast extreme weather events, take early action, and thereby prevent human suffering. How does it work? Well, based on forecast information and risk analysis, FBF releases humanitarian funding for pre-agreed activities for early actions to be performed quickly and efficiently before disaster strikes. The key to this is a so-called early action protocol, which clearly defines the most important tasks and responsibilities to be addressed immediately before and after events. And obviously, no agency will maintain credibility if we don't listen to our customer. A year ago this month, Puerto Rico experienced a series of significant earthquakes. The first visits by Red Cross volunteers immediately after the shocks highlighted the issue of restoring communication connectivity so people could learn what's going on and communicate with their loved ones. So we restored connectivity with mobile hotspots and chargers. That action allowed the people to quickly address a major anxiety and provided confidence that the Red Cross was actually listening to them. I have several examples of preparedness work, community involvement, adaptation to COVID and other circumstances we can discuss later, but my time is up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Much appreciated. Next up, we have Greg Cormier. He is the humanitarian lead at Mercy Corps for his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Chloe. Thanks, Sam, for going first. That was quite a lot of pressure, huh? Mercy Corps integrates resilience into our humanitarian responses through contextual analysis and risk identification, mapping capacities of local social networks, identifying the most vulnerable communities, and ultimately, pairing interventions that address immediate risks and needs, while also building resilience of communities to be better prepared for cyclical or any other future shocks. A good example of this can be found in our Bahamas program, for which the American Red Cross is a donor. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Dorian, Mercy Corps made a long-term commitment to support recovery in the Bahamas through provision of life-saving and life-sustaining programming, while also supporting local small and medium enterprises. Apologies. With grants and mentorship in order to assist in the recovery of the local economy. The mentorships are provided through Micro Mentor, a Mercy Corps program that connects local and international mentors with business owners and entrepreneurs. The grants, liquidity always being a need during and after crises, are meant to address the rebuilding and recurring costs, and the mentorships are meant to build skills of the business owners. The mentorship program continues supporting business owners in improving their financial and computer literacy skills, thus allowing for better planning and an opportunity to grow their businesses and clients. It's important to note that small and medium enterprise sector is a critical economic engine for the Caribbean, with at least 40% of the region's GDP derived from these businesses, and accounting for almost 70% of the employment in most Caribbean countries. Small and medium enterprises are responsible for a significant number of accessible jobs created in the region, and therefore play an important role in alleviating poverty and reducing socioeconomic and gender inequality across the region. Those who have participated in the Micro Mentor program, as an example, have shown marked increases in their confidence in a number of skills, most significantly in finance-related skills. Additionally, this most recent year, business owners who took part in the mentoring program reported about a 22% decrease in the number of employees in their businesses, implying ultimately that 78% of the jobs were able to be retained during the pandemic, despite all of the challenges. Speaking of this past year, the pandemic has brought a litany of new challenges to the region, particularly around the dynamics of a protracted crisis, something relatively novel to the region. Traditionally, emergency response programming in Latin America has focused on building back better after natural disasters and cyclical threats such as hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, and landslides. Where Mercy Corps' greatest value add has always been is through providing small businesses and individuals with cash and liquidity to rebuild their homes or businesses, and to provide multi-purpose cash assistance at the household level to ensure families can provide the basic necessities for themselves and their loved ones. Due to the protracted nature and complexity of COVID-19, Mercy Corps has adapted our regional response and resilience activities for the Latin America region to account for the new reality. Distinct lockdowns and travel restrictions in each country have put a lot of small businesses in peril. Businesses have not been able to stay open to serve their local communities, and tourists have not been traveling due to border closures and travel advisories. Mercy Corps, therefore, is focused on assisting businesses in modernizing the way they engage with their customers and financial institutions in this new reality. Though we have always connected small and medium businesses with mentors, the needs of the businesses have changed due to the nature and protractedness of the global crisis. So we've begun to assist small businesses with reaching clients and potential clients from home by supporting businesses with social media outreach, booking for goods and services online, and receiving payments online. We've been supporting businesses with converting to curbside pickup options for their goods through mobile applications. And we've been supporting business owners in banking and managing finances online, a particularly relevant skill in the archipelago of the Bahamas. Through these resilience activities and ultimately having more frequent and sustained engagement with client bases, participating businesses have reported that they've been able to grow their reach and diversify their client base, while also diversifying their goods and services portfolio. Mercy Corps additionally has adapted the delivery of life-saving and life-sustaining humanitarian assistance. The COVID-19 crisis has made it harder for everyone, particularly cash transactions and face-to-face interactions. Anything we can do to increase the way that local commerce is done will ultimately benefit the community. In Colombia, as an example, Mercy Corps has adapted the multi-purpose cash assistance program to register and deliver cash directly to program participants, monitor program impact and quality, and receive feedback directly from participants remotely in order to keep program participants safe and reduce exposure points. This has allowed for program participants to not have to compromise safety in an effort to receive humanitarian assistance. Lockdowns, curfews, and social distancing have required new ways of serving communities in vulnerable conditions with reliable information as well. Taking advantage of the significant social capital earned in these communities, we've had to find creative ways to reach out to program participants. One example has been able to be replicated in a litany of countries in which we work. Would be that Mercy Corps' toll-free advice line, which has reached over 2 million Haitians with public health messages, including advice for parents during lockdowns, which has been done in partnership with digital media partner Viamo. We've been able to replicate this program in Haiti, in the Bahamas as well, in order to reach the Haitian migrant population. Additionally, through social media and other networks, we've reached over 250,000 young people in Puerto Rico and Colombia to provide advice on social distancing. The nature of the global pandemic has changed the context in which we all live and work, but has also provided us an opportunity to implement new and innovative ways to improve resilience in crisis and post-crisis contexts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Next, we'll move to Becca Curtis-Heald. Becca serves as the Deputy Director for the Caribbean Resilience Program at the Clinton Foundation. Becca?
Hi, thanks so much, Chloe, and thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here. So I'll talk a little bit about what the Clinton Foundation has done in this space. And I work with a part of the foundation called the Clinton Global Initiative, which since 2005 has acted as a convening platform for organizations from the nonprofit sector, government, and private businesses to come together and work together to address global challenges that span a litany of issues, but including disaster response. So after the 2017 hurricane season, when Irma and Maria devastated the region, the Caribbean region that is, local leaders were asking President Clinton to have the foundation play some sort of supporting role in the recovery process and in building more resilience in the region. So we started having conversations with leaders in Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Dominica, and other islands that were really impacted by that hurricane season to see what the needs were and how we could leverage our network to support and meet those needs. At the same time, organizations in our network, humanitarian organizations and other civil society groups, as well as businesses, were asking us to connect them with others who were responding. And there's this clear need for more coordination and more of a platform for people to just freely share their work and their challenges and really, come together and break down silos to do more work in recovery. So we launched the Action Network on Post-Disaster Recovery in response to these needs, which has been running for the past 3 years. And again, just brings together different organizations to collaborate on projects and really workshop different issues. So I'll share 3 lessons that we've learned through this work really briefly with you all today. The first is really just CGI as a convener. We often have to remind ourselves this, but sometimes just putting really smart people in a room together is really helpful. And just giving people the opportunity to see who else is working in the same geographies or the same sectors, making sure that efforts aren't being duplicated and that people have a chance to collaborate and sort of connect in a neutral space where there's not competition, and people can really just freely workshop issues that they have and share needs and resources with one another. So that's a big learning for us. The second is really, as others have mentioned already today, that the agenda needs to be driven by local needs, like first and foremost, and really solely driven by local needs. So when we started the Action Network, we started with a number of conversations, a couple trips, and a big event where we had, 100 or so stakeholders from different islands that were impacted talking about key issues in a number of different sectors. And I think what we learned from that was sort of prioritizing that listening with local organizations brought issues to the fore that we probably wouldn't have realized were important to sort of elevate in our platform. So the issue of mental health is one that I often think of in this realm. Conversations with different organizations in the education sector, business, as well as health, of course, were surfacing the challenges posed to recovery by the fact that so many people had experienced such traumatic events during the hurricanes that were really impeding their ability to sort of move forward with their lives and start the rebuilding process. So that's an issue that we've really focused on a lot at CGI over the past few years, is that issue of mental health and what partnerships can we kind of help people establish to address those needs. So again, I think just listening to the priorities that you may not hear otherwise unless you're engaging with local stakeholders. And then third is really just the power of cross-sector partnerships, as I mentioned before. And at CGI, this takes the form of what we call commitments to action. And several of my fellow panelists have made these commitments through the CGI platform over the past few years. And these are basically just organizations stepping up saying, we're going to commit to do more to advance renewable energy in the region, or do housing rebuilds, or a number of things. And this has proven to be a really powerful model because it allows people to sort of not only feature their work through CGI, but connect with other partners who can build on what they're already doing. So for instance, in Dominica, after Hurricane Maria, the local telecoms company Digicel rebuilt a number of schools in a very vulnerable area of the country that had been damaged by the hurricane. And obviously that was a critical need. But then they told us there was a need for not only rebuilding, but making sure that those schools had access to power and had access to resources to stay open in the face of future disasters. So we were able to bring in Expedia, the tourism company, to support the installation of solar energy at those schools. And I think that's a great example of how you can bring together people who probably wouldn't meet each other. A big company like Expedia might not have the opportunity to sort of get to know a local school in a very remote area of Dominica, but through that sort of cross-sector collaboration, we were able to help Digicel leverage additional partnerships to increase the impact of that work. So yeah, cross-sector partnerships are the one. That's all for me.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Becca. Moving on, we have Frank Ford. Frank is the Chief Readiness and Contingency Operations, works on Chief Readiness and Contingency Operations for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Frank?
Thank you. Good morning, Chloe. And I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to have a discussion on resilience and response operations. I really appreciate, the linkage between resilience and response. During an event, we often think about mitigation. And mitigation is really important, but it really focuses on the what. What actions are we going to take to reduce the impacts of the next event? But to me, resilience is the how. How are we going to strengthen systems to make them more survivable during an event? And as mentioned, I work with the Corps of Engineers, and so we always we think about systems and infrastructure when we think about these events. And so, to us, the resilience is really important. It's extremely important as you look at the Caribbean. You look at Latin America and the Gulf regions. Most of this region is dominated by coastline. And like most of the coast, a majority of our population live along the coastline. In the US alone, we have about 40% of our population, about 150 million citizens, live in coastal communities. And so besides, the coastal area being our home, it's also an economic driver for the area. You think about the economic activities, port operations, harbors, fisheries, tourism, service industries that support these activities. They rely on a healthy and productive coastal environment and with stable infrastructure. So resilient concepts are really important to the community and the economy. And I believe, a key to this is the ability to develop sustainable, resilient concepts. And like I said, as engineers, we often immediately go to structures, but we have to think: do the concepts work within the natural surroundings? Can they be sustained by local government? Are they acceptable by the local community? Do they fit into the culture and the surroundings of the area? And so we have to take all these considerations into effect. For us, we often think about some of these systems, structural-based solutions being storm barriers, seawalls, levees, breakwater systems. All these are designed to protect the local infrastructure, to be able to absorb the energy, the wave action, and prevent inland flooding. But there are many non-structural and cost-effective opportunities to protect coastal infrastructure that we're really now starting to consider and starting to work on. As you think about climate and climate change and how it impacts the coastal region, we really have a vulnerable area that we must consider and think about as we develop these resilient systems. So, things that we're looking at: healthy coral reef systems, sand dunes, marsh, wetlands, barrier islands. These perform really well at dissipating wave energy. These work really well to prevent inland flooding and to stabilize the shoreline. And again, when you think about resilience, for us at least, we think about resilient systems and the resilient infrastructure that supports the local economy and the population. So we think these efforts, combined with good, strong zoning and building codes, along with strong communities, they really help to create a resilient coastal region. When you think about a strong community, it extends beyond the local population. It really gets that regional capacity. It's tough and expensive to maintain all the capabilities and resources required during the response. And so you need friends, you need regional alliances and compacts to help shoulder the load. I often say that, if the first time we meet during an event, when stress is high and sleep is little, decisions are rapid, and frustration is present, then our first meeting is probably not going to go that well. And so with this in mind, how do we build regional alliances and build trust before the event happens? Often we say, make a friend before you need a friend. And I believe this is one of the most tried and true ways of building these these regional relationships is through shared common experiences, through regional get-togethers, conferences, training opportunities, much like we're doing right now during the Action for Disaster Relief ADR 2021. This is helping build those regional friendships and alliances that are so needed during an event. And the last point I'll leave you with is to support strong communities and regional alliances. You must be able to share information with each other. Sharing data, it's hard enough within your own agency. It's hard enough during blue sky conditions, but it's even harder in gray sky conditions. It's not just the technical hoops that you have to jump through to make information sharing capable, but it's often the policies, the policy hurdles that you have to get over to make information sharing possible. And so these are some things that we think about as engineers and think about when we consider how do we respond and build resiliency into our coastal regions. And so I look forward to having discussions today, look forward to learning from the panel and learning from each other as we look at building resilient, responsive coastal regions. Thank you, Chloe.
Thanks, Frank. As you mentioned, it is really great that we can still all come together to share experiences and model, resilience building and networking in practice, even in spite of the challenges we are currently facing. Last but certainly not least, we have Donna Kaya Han. She is the executive lead for disaster response at GlobalGiving. Donna?
It's fair to say that GlobalGiving, which is a very different organization than many of my panelists represent, and it's exciting that that we've got so much diversity on our panel, folks coming from different perspectives. So we're somewhat unique in that we are a nonprofit whose entire mission is to help support other nonprofits. And we have a very lofty goal of trying to transform the philanthropy sector and the aid sector through accelerating community-led change. And it's exciting to see that the sector is very strongly moving in this direction. Many think of us as a crowdfunding platform, but we also work with more than 200 corporate partners on a variety of philanthropic programs, and disaster response is a very unique program for GlobalGiving. Whereas we work with 5,000 nonprofits across more than 150 countries who use our platform and our tools for training and access to peer learning, as well as for crowdfunding. When it comes to disaster response, we tend to operate more like a grant maker. We typically will post a general relief and recovery fund for major crises. And then we shift gears to begin identifying partners and identifying new partners who are responding. Depending upon the amount of funding we raise, of course, we're able to not just to support immediate relief, but ongoing rebuilding, resilience, and yes, preparedness. And so a couple of examples I would give, we've been doing this, I should say, since 2004, and just like our name implies, we do it globally. We have responded to natural disasters and humanitarian crises in more than 80 countries in the last 15 years. And of course, this would be from the California wildfires to earthquakes in Nepal, crises in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, Latin America and the Caribbean. And so a couple of examples of how we are approaching things both from the standpoint of local nonprofits and resilience would be our Hurricane Maria Fund, for which we raised about $13 million. That was augmented by corporate funding as well. And we were able within just a number of days to begin dispersing funds to a handful of existing partners in Puerto Rico, as well as international nonprofits. So we take a we try to take a good contextual perspective and know that often it is our large international nonprofit partners who are best equipped to support immediate relief, and then increasingly shift to supporting local organizations. So in Puerto Rico, for instance, we worked hard to build a large community of Puerto Rican nonprofits. And of course, in Puerto Rico, the earthquakes and the pandemic have added so much complexity. But we have been able to support through several local partners systems for resilience. So we've made multiple grants from our fund for solar installations, including solar installations on emergency response locations like fire departments. Just very, very grassroots efforts, frankly, as international aid was so slow to come, or I guess I should say national aid. In addition, we've had the opportunity to work with Fundación Comunitario in Puerto Rico on an aqueduct system program that they are trying to repair many of the 247 aqueducts, many of which were laying fallow. And these are all being led by these efforts and run by community members and committees in very remote parts of Puerto Rico. And we're working to not just support this rebuilding and reestablishment of these aqueducts, but in the creation of an association for these groups so that they can aggregate their learning and power. A different example would be the Bahamas, where there were very few nonprofits in the GlobalGiving community, but we were able to support a couple very, very quickly. But in that case, we have been supporting more international nonprofits in the rebuilding efforts, which, as many of you know, have been very stalled by the pandemic. We always try to bring humility and trust to our conversations. Set my timer, so I'm going to wrap up real quickly to our conversations. And that approach that we have taken in this past year is just to shift all of our contributions to unrestricted grants, to really donations to our nonprofit partners. I'd be happy to talk more about any of what we're up to in the discussion. And thanks again for having us join you.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks, everyone. Now we will move to our discussion piece of the panel. So 2020 was in so many ways a year for the record books in terms of disasters. These extreme events have, physical, social, and economic impacts. So I guess my question is, how do you build comprehensive resilience strategies that encompass, financial, business, community needs to address these impacts and leverage those networks? And how do you balance, when we had this kind of overwhelming and really unique crisis in the pandemic, how do you balance that with some of the more kind of traditional resilience building, disaster response and relief kind of measures that are still very important in the face of hurricanes and wildfires and earthquakes and all of those other challenges? So I guess we can go, if no one's burning to sort of answer this right away, why don't we go back to Sam?
Hey, I'll be glad to answer. It has been remarkable. There's several directions that we address our operation, certainly in the COVID times, and made it unusual. And I think that a lot of what we have done is not unusual in the nonprofit organizations, and that we, first of all, take great concern and care about the responders, our volunteers who are on the ground, making sure that they are prepared not only with the equipment, but with the training and with the ability to share that training. I know that within most of our, I would say most of our, if not all of our resiliency and preparedness trainings and activities that are happening and have happened since COVID became an issue. They have been really according to the codes we expect, smaller groups, if in person at all. Of course, a lot of people in a lot of places that we work with don't have the capacity to do what we're doing here with virtual training, virtual conversations. So the on-site activities have been really controlled. And they have been a primary part of every training that we do because we've added that into the curriculum. We've also done, and I was glad to hear this addressed by Becca with the Clinton Foundation, the importance of psychosocial. During this time, there has been, I would say, nothing in addition to the typical disaster crises and issues and impacts. There's been nothing more critical than the psychosocial issues that everybody was dealing with. Responders dealing with the concerns for themselves and their families, the concerns for the people that they're responding to. How do we deal with that? And we've had ongoing weekly sessions for volunteers and I think for others who want to join that deal with psychosocial issues. When I say weekly, I say that because one week is in English, the other next week is in Spanish, so that we reach everybody and we include everybody. I also think during this time, one of the things that I've seen different is that some of the people that would normally be on the ground after a Hurricane Iota or Hurricane Eta are working remotely. So the administrative kinds of what we may refer to as disaster management issues and conversations are done remotely, not done on site. It's good and bad. It's good because that's what we have to do to protect people, both our own volunteers and clients and local people. We don't want to bring somebody be carrying something to a different location. But certainly the people that are handling it that way, this is not their life. Their life is being on the ground, being in front of people, helping people, being there, being able to touch, being able to hug. And right now we can't do that. So that is a difficult aspect. But those are some of the adaptations that we have made. And I'm looking forward to hearing some of the other ideas.
And Sam, you touched on this a little bit in your answer just now, and Greg did during his presentation as well. One of the things, when I think about the word inclusiveness, especially in this work, I think about grassroots, I think about outreach, I think about, events where we bring people together, or we reach out into the local community and try to really get in front of people. It's very touchy-feely in that way. And obviously the pandemic has made us all kind of come together through staying apart. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit more about kind of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities of the technology that we've all been forced to kind of invest in and spend so much time with. Are you ready to throw out Zoom at the end of this all, or do you see it having an impact moving forward?
Boy, that's a good
Greg, maybe Greg should start us off since he really touched on technology.
Please.
Sorry, Sam, don't mean to butt in, huh? Thanks, Chloe. Yeah, I would say that we really had sort of our answer would be that we've relied on two things. One is localization, and the second would be technology. At the beginning of the pandemic, we started operating under a sort of the assumption of not being able to travel due to border closures, and more importantly, the safety of our staff and things of that nature. So we really had to rely on, number one, the Mercy Corps sort of global strategy of really improving the capacity of local teams on the ground, local partners on the ground, and sort of the resilience that's built into that. We started obviously having a bit more engagement remotely, as I mentioned, through technology, and giving opportunities under this new reality to have more capacity building opportunities. We started doing emergency preparedness with our local teams, trying to identify new risks and trying to be as prepared as possible as we could for those risks, while also creating lists and solutions to problems and new adaptations for our program. And the second, as I mentioned, is really a heavy reliance on technology. So the most obvious one is something like Zoom, where we're able to get people all together that otherwise maybe would have had to travel, or traditionally that would have been the first option, is to get people together. We've had to bring people together on things like platforms like Zoom, use things like Jamboards that sort of facilitate discussions. But importantly, regarding our programming, we've really started to pivot and use this as an opportunity for innovative modalities of implementing our both resilience and humanitarian response programming. So I had mentioned previously about a lot of our resilience programming is assisting businesses to move to online platforms to allow sort of receipt of purchase orders or requests from clients, to receive payments online, to grow their client base. And really importantly, to have discussions with their clients, which allows them to have a better, let's say, a more longer term, more sustained feedback from their clients. Another example would be that we use mobile platforms for cash transfers as well, at a very large scale in quite a few countries. There are obviously drawbacks to some of these things in terms of having closer monitoring, being able to build, let's say, that social capital that Mercy Corps really relies on. It's a bit more difficult, as you say, when we do things like that remotely. But at this point, it's in the best interest of the program participants as well, to keep sort of mobilization, to keep movement down. So we've made some adjustments to the way that we monitor things, to the way that we do our due diligence, but it's all in the best interest of do no harm. So I would say those would be the two major pillars, is really leaning on our global strategy of the past few years of improving the capacities of both our local teams, but in addition to that, our partners locally. And secondly is really using this as an opportunity to pivot to sort of more advanced, more technology driven solutions in both our humanitarian programming, but also our sort of resilience and capacity building program.
Yeah, and Greg, you touched on this a bit in your answer here. One of the challenges of working in the Caribbean has always been kind of inter-island travel generally, getting supplies on and off of islands. These challenges have been with us for a long time. I feel like I can envision a world in which technology addresses some of those challenges, but also it can exclude people because we also have all of the connectivity challenges and the access problems. Has anyone else experienced this? Is there something you'd like to share touching on that?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think you just hit on a point that I was just thinking exactly. Like, one of the paradoxes of the Caribbean being a small region is that it's so difficult to travel between the islands. You have to go through Barbados, you have to go to Miami. Like, I think all of us who've worked in the Caribbean know this. So I think one perk of this sort of Zoom world that we're living in is that we've been able to sort of increase the diversity of representation of different Caribbean islands in our convenings over the last year or so. Obviously, CGI, we used to host, a couple 700-person in-person events. So that has massively shifted. We've had to really change how we bring people together. But I think that's been a huge perk, actually, is it's much easier to get that sort of pan-Caribbean perspective, which is often so challenging because of the different jurisdictions and the language barriers and the travel that you mentioned. So I think, I hope that with more programs to increase access to the internet and improve that access, that this can actually be a lasting tool for the Caribbean to sort of come together as a block on some of these issues.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think from Global Giving's perspective, we've been primarily a virtual organization for our entire existence. And in some ways, as Becca was just saying, the last year has leveled the playing field a little bit. To your point, Chloe, of course, there are obviously inequities in access and quality of connectivity and those sorts of things. But we've seen so many more of our partners around the world, including Latin America and the Caribbean, use relatively small amounts of funds to increase their technological capabilities. And so, as I mentioned to the panelists before we got started here, I spent a couple hours with 350 nonprofits from around the world. And, that compares to in prior years for our sort of open house, if you will, maybe 150 to 200. And so we're seeing much more engagement. We also saw in 2020, kind of paradoxically, the largest increase in the number of nonprofit partners applying to be part of the Global Giving platform, and being able, to effectively navigate a 100% virtual and online process for that application and crowdfunding, et cetera. And so we're actually seeing some surprising effects because of the sort of increasing use of technology by more and more folks in the field.
Donna, I want to stick with you for a minute because I think you're well positioned to sort of answer this next question, or start to, which is something you mentioned. You mentioned a community-led approach and really looking at change from that level. I'm curious how you balance resilience priorities in terms of local versus regional versus global. The Americas is certainly a very diverse region for some of the reasons we mentioned. I mean, flipping back and forth between English and Spanish alone is a constant in the region. But how do you make sure that you're always kind of bringing it back local when, especially if priorities are being set by administrators or somebody who's working at the global level in a remote environment where they're even now having perhaps less access to that kind of on the ground feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the honest answer is we're still figuring that out. We actually fielded, this began before the pandemic sort of locked things down, a study last year on what does it mean to be community-led. And we worked with the Global Fund for Community Foundations out of South Africa, and they conducted research across the globe. I'm happy to share that, share those findings. But the ultimate takeaway, at least my takeaway from the results there, was it has to do with how can we as a global grant maker and partner provide resources and support efforts that are about building the leadership and agency of those organizations in the field in their environments. And so we are beginning to think of resilience in that way as well, which is really, of course, all the things that my colleagues here are focused on, but it's also leadership development. It's also capacity building for local leaders so that they are able to better advocate for what they know to be the priorities. Oftentimes, as we all know, in very bureaucratic and sometimes very difficult to navigate governmental or intergovernmental kind of environments. I'll stop there and let others pipe in, because I know there are probably other points of view.
Okay, well, I will change tacks a little bit, and I would love to go back to Becca. You had talked a little bit about some of the really interesting kind of sustainability-led approaches to resilience building and the commitment to sustainability, which I think is really great. What I have noticed, although in some of the resilience and disaster response work, is that there tends to be a tension between these two. So how do you kind of juggle these two priorities, and how do you maybe build resilience in or build sustainability into your planning process so that the two are not kind of undermining each other?
Yeah, that is a great point. I think it's a really good point. I think there's so much, there is a tension here. I think we've seen it even with COVID, things as, we were sort of, I think in the US at least, sort of trying to get away from single-use items, for instance, and now due to the safety concerns, we're going straight back to that. So I think there's definitely that issue in a lot of these situations. But I would say in terms of the sustainability piece, it's really just, I think, making the case for it. And I think there's also, this sort of idea that everything needs to be innovative and everything needs to be new, but I don't really think that that's true. I think what we found in our work is that solutions exist normally at the community level, often in these smaller communities that have sort of been on the front lines of disaster after disaster, and they've developed their own safety nets and sort of their own ways of helping their neighbors. And I think really maybe one way to bring attention is just tapping into those solutions at the local level that exist and trying to get them the resources they need to sort of institutionalize those. So hopefully that can sort of be a middle ground between those tensions.
I love that in answering that question, you sort of went back to the previous question about local versus global regional priorities, kind of put them all together with a neat little bow around them. But it looks like, Sam, did you want to add something in there?
Well, yeah, I have a thought here, and I have a different perspective on those things. I think sustainability and resiliency are very closely related, because if you're going to be resilient, you need to keep your resilience sustainable. And that means marrying the two issues as much as possible in terms of utilizing approaches and assets and resources that are appropriate for resiliency, and to do our best to make sure that they are also sustainable. And a lot of that deals with things that are very basic in terms of as we talk about technology, for instance. Let's remember, this isn't as true in the Caribbean as it is through the Americas and certainly the world. But we're talking about communities where during COVID, the Red Cross and other agencies had to put in hand washing stations. That's how basic response and how basic needs are in many parts of the world still. So I just look at resiliency and sustainability. We want to sustain those things that keep us resilient. So just my two bits.
So Thanks, Sam. Frank, I want to change over to you, and I think you can probably maybe address some of what we're talking about here, maybe in response to this question, which is you touched on the process of mitigation, right? As opposed to kind of recovery and response. So I want to get into that a little bit because, you know, recovery and response gets a lot of attention, right? But mitigation and also preparedness get a lot less funding, attention, resource, et cetera. How would you suggest that the community kind of, I hate to say leverage, but you know, you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste, right? We've seen a lot of major events since 2017 through 2020. It was a period of a lot of different crises. And I think there is a lot of attention of like, we can do better. We can't just keep letting this happen and keep responding. So how can we kind of shift the focus so that we are better prepared and that we're mitigating some of this risk?
Okay, now I appreciate the question, and often when we're in the you think about mitigation, you think about response. Often when we're in the event, we immediately start to think about mitigation. What can I do in the future to prevent this from happening again? How can I reduce the impacts of the next event on my community, on my local government, on my infrastructure? And so there is that element, but to me, as you think about mitigation, it's really the resilience element of mitigation that I think we need to look at. How can I change the environment in the future so that the next event doesn't impact me? How can I build resilience into my systems so that the next event has a reduced impact on my community? I think back to Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma in the Caribbean. As soon as Hurricane Maria hit, it quickly became realized that the power grid, the Puerto Rican power grid, was totally destroyed. Or 80 to 90% of it was destroyed. And so you have 3 million people. You have a number of communities that need to get their power back. And so how do you quickly restore power to 3 million people while at the same time build resiliency into the system? It's friction there. There's time that's required to do that. And so, our job as we think about responses is to bring back a sense of normalcy to the local community, to bring back a sense of normalcy to that population. And so you think about a Maria again, it impacted the power grid, which then it brings down the wastewater treatment facilities. It prevents you from having telecommunications and access to social networks. It prevents you from having cold food in the grocery stores or being able to get gas at a gas station. It impacts your medical, your 911, and your police stations. And so you have all this tension to get the power back on, but yet a desire to build in resiliency. So as you execute response operations, you have to have an eye towards resiliency so that the concept of resiliency can be introduced into your build back, into your response operation. So the actions I'm taking today, I have to understand that I want to build back a stronger, better system. And so decisions I'm making today will influence resiliency 5, 6, 7 months down the road. So we just want to make sure we account for that and make sure that we have ways to introduce resiliency in the long term while executing response operations in the near and short term. And I think that's part of it. It's just really thinking about and considering resiliency in response operations really helps posture us for resilience opportunities in the future. Thank you.
Okay. Greg, why don't you jump in here? I know that you had wanted to respond on this point as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really, I felt like I just wanted to build on what the colleagues on the panel have said already, and they've said it in a lot of different ways. But essentially, I think that what they were trying to mention could be summarized in the relatively common phrase of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we try to build, I think as Mercy Corps, we really try to build that into a lot of our programs. Sam had mentioned something about hand washing stations. Water and sanitation hygiene is such an important pillar to Mercy Corps' regional strategy, of course, here in the Americas, but also our global strategy. And so though hand washing stations, let's say, can be part of a sort of humanitarian response, in addition to it, it's resilience programming as well. It can really help to build hygiene practices in migration crises or in a pandemic. let's say they pair well with the actual humanitarian response of providing the water or providing the hygiene kits themselves. So for us in Mercy Corps, we've always tried to ensure that resilience was built into all of our humanitarian programs and try to diminish that, let's say, the tension that the colleagues have mentioned. The way that's being done is the way that we do that is through an understanding of context, really, which can only be done through having a really good understanding of the local community and investment in that community. Let's say staff or colleagues from that area, and that really helps us to understand what, the when, the who, the where of risks and threats. I say the when because a lot of them in Americas are quite cyclical. So building in, let's say, resilience programs and sort of answers to those future questions into our programs is really important for us. We try to understand the capacities of partners and personnel on the ground. Even if we identify a partner who maybe doesn't have the capacities required at the moment, the mapping of those local capacities is a really important step in being resilient and being able to respond to a future shock or a future trauma. So yeah, I would say that for us, let's say the balance between the two, let's say humanitarian response and the resilience programming for us is really found in this idea that if we invest, as I mentioned, sort of, or as Frank had mentioned as well today, $100 today, is that worth, does that save us and the community, not just in finances, of course, but in human capital? Does that save us 1,000 in the future? So yeah, I would say that it's really important to integrate the two in all contexts, in all humanitarian crises.
I'm pleased to hear that there's a lot of agreement there that we need to do that and that we're moving in that direction. I am cognizant of the time. We only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to kind of do a last round with everybody and end us on sort of an optimistic, positive note. I have been pleased that this panel has not been a total Debbie Downer, as disaster panels can be sometimes, but that's I guess the resilience influence. So I'm curious for your thoughts on looking forward into the future. How will resilience planning and the resilience approach change? And how are we learning some ways to innovate? What gives you hope as we move into this next year? Donna, why don't we start with you?
I'm super excited to have listened to this panel and our colleagues here. I think that the movement toward, as some are calling it, shifting the power into the hands of local community leaders in driving the priorities, aided by the significant experience and resources of organizations like those that are represented here, has the potential to really, really transform things. And so I remain hopeful that that sort of bottom up, top down merging will continue, and integration will continue, and we'll see, even more creative solutions toward resilience across the region.
Thanks, Donna. Frank?
Thank you. I think the thing that excites me is that resilience and resilient concepts are no longer foreign. It's accepted, it's mainstream. 5, 10, 15 years ago, if you brought and relegated to the back row, but now there's a desire by communities, by local governments, by populations to really build in sustainable, resilient systems, and they're accepting to that. And so, to me, that's exciting. It's mainstream, and it's where we're going. It's what we need to do in order to make sure that we're able to have these resilient communities. So that excites me.
Yeah, it does seem like there is a shift happening, at least in the approach of kind of the non-practitioner community. Becca.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo what both Donna and Frank just said. I think the shift towards looking at communities as sort of holding the solutions and the fact that, we're sort of coming into agreement that we need to get more resources into their hands is really exciting. And the mainstreaming of just resilience as a concept. And then I would also say, I think, sometimes there's been an issue with funding flows a lot, right around a disaster, and has typically been less available sort of for the longer term recovery, and obviously for these preparedness efforts when you're looking at sort of grant funding for NGOs and things like that. But I've definitely, even in the last few years, seen a shift in philanthropic partners that we work with at CGI in funding many more preparedness projects, which I think is really great and shows a big sort of step in the right direction.
Thank you, Becca. Greg?
Yeah, I would say the sort of new reality has really re-emphasized, let's say, that the disasters don't happen in a vacuum, and oftentimes those that sometimes there's a need to sort of reevaluate exactly how we go about doing resilience programming. One of the easy references was, as I mentioned previously, that in other disasters there was a need to really respond to humanitarian disasters in the Americas, hurricanes or earthquakes, and to sort of build back better. That was the idea regarding the resilience. Now there's a real felt need by the community to sort of advance their own, let's say, digital literacy and their use of technology. And so it is for me and for Mercy Corps, it's been really impressive to see how quickly the local community has seen that this is a need, that this is an activity that we can take to support them in that, improving digital literacy at a large scale, and to see how, though this may have been a need in the past, it wasn't necessarily a felt need. And so it's been nice to see how these sort of innovative, despite the challenges, these innovative changes have really been utilized to sort of move a lot of the communities forward in their sort of technical capacities, and sort of grow in some ways despite the challenges.
And Sam, over to you for our concluding pearls of wisdom.
Everything that's been said has been articulated very well. So I'll end with this follow-up to what Frank was talking about. I think is a good example of maybe what we call a continuum of care of our infrastructure growth and our resiliency building. And that is with PREPA, with the basics that were dealt with immediately after the storm, which obviously took many months to rebuild the electrical system. Now we're at the stage, because of that base that's there, that we and the public are beginning to hear the conversations of building sustainability, of looking at solar for the long-term impact. So it is that we need to, as Frank articulated so well, begin with the basics, because we have to get people into a normalcy. And from that, that's our future. That's where we grow. That's the exciting thing. That's the innovation for the Clinton Foundation and for GlobalGiving and the other donors to be partners with as we figure out these long-term sustainable resilient programs.
Well, thank you all. I am feeling more optimistic about our chances for building a resilient future and world. That is all we have time for today on panel 2 for resilience and response. I'd like to thank my distinguished panelists as well as our organizers at Action on Disaster Relief. Thanks for joining us.